We'll continue this week with Deuteronomy 21. Now, last time we discussed chapter 21, verses 1 to 9, and the subject was unsolved murder. As we saw, however, this was set in the far larger context of something called blood guilt. And blood guilt occurs when one or more of God's laws concerning blood have been violated. Now, this week we're going to start a pretty well delineated section of Torah beginning at Deuteronomy 21, chapter 10, continuing through chapter 25, that many scholars and teachers call it a list of miscellaneous laws. My only quarrel with that description is it gives the impression that these laws aren't laid down in any particular structure, gives the impression that there's no common theme, when in fact that's not the case at all. This 4-chapter section deals with 4 main issues: holy war, sex and family, care for the poorest and the most vulnerable of society, and humanitarian concerns. Now, I mentioned at the start of our study on the book of Deuteronomy that what Moses is doing is expounding on the laws that had been laid down almost 40 years earlier in Mount Sinai. Moses is giving a sermon that has a very interesting parallel in the New Testament in Yeshua's famous Sermon on the Mount, found in the book of Matthew. In both cases, the purpose and the focus is to take these ancient laws and invigorate them with deeper spiritual meaning in some cases, and a better or even more contemporary defined life application in other cases. So what we find when we back away and we look at this section from a broader view is that these laws we're going to look at are just extensions of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th commandments of the 10 Commandments. Therefore, the subjects revolve around killing, adultery, including the essence of adultery that's a combination of unfaithfulness and unlawful mixture, then theft, then false witness, then coveting. And by the way, that's the way the structure of the law is. This can't be said enough. All the law, and Christ said it, is based on 2 commandments. Love God with all your mind, heart, and being, and love your neighbor as yourself. On top of that, then is built the 10 Commandments that tells you how to bring that about. What does that mean? What does that look like? Then the remaining 603 laws, at least traditionally, that's what it is that we see in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then some of it's repeated and modified a bit in Deuteronomy, are built on the 10 Commandments. You can take every commandment, every law, and bring it right back and connect it to one of the 10 Commandments. And all the 10 Commandments are connected to either love your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, or love your neighbor as yourself. That's the structure. Now, the focus of today's lesson, then, is going to be mainly marriage and family law. And the first thing we're going to deal with has to do with the marriage of a woman who's been captured in a war. Now, this would be a good time for me to remind you that the subject matter of Deuteronomy 20, which was holy war, continues on to Deuteronomy 21. And that any kind of war, by definition, deals, of course, with the killing of human beings. Here's the thing to understand as it concerns God-ordained warfare called holy war. Killing done under the rules he's laid down is justified. It's acceptable to him, all others not. It's not murder. If a person kills according to the rules, and therefore the killer, a soldier, will remain at peace with God. Killing outside of the rules of holy warfare that God has ordained is not justified. And therefore it brings that soldier, that person, as well as his community and even the land, blood guilt. So let's read Deuteronomy chapter 21:10, and we're going to read on to the end of the chapter. Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning at verse 10. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, you'll find it on page 220. If you don't, I don't know where it is. Except that it's after Numbers. When you go out to war against your enemies, and Adonai your God hands them over to you, and you take prisoners, and you see among the prisoners a woman who looks good to you, and you feel attracted to her, and you want her as your wife, you are to bring her home to your house, where she will shave her head, cut her fingernails, remove her prison clothing. She will stay there in your house, mourning her mother and father for a full month, after which you may go in and to have sexual relations with her and be her husband, and she'll be your wife. In the event that you lose interest in her, you are to let her go wherever she wishes, but you may not sell her for money or treat her like a slave, because you've humiliated her. If a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and unloved wives have borne him children, and if the firstborn son is the child of the unloved wife, then when it comes time for him to pass his inheritance on to his sons, he may not give the inheritance due the firstborn to the son of the loved wife in place of the unloved one, who is in fact the firstborn. No, he must acknowledge as firstborn the son of the unloved wife by giving him a double portion of everything he owns, for he is the firstfruits of his manhood, and the right of the firstborn is his. If a man has a stubborn, rebellious son who will not obey what his father or mother says, and even after they discipline him, he still refuses to pay attention to them, then his father and mother are to take hold of him and bring him out to the leaders of his town at the gate of that place, and say to the leaders of the town, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He doesn't pay attention to us, lives wildly, and he gets drunk. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. In this way you will put an end to such wickedness among you, and all Israel will hear about it and be afraid. If someone has committed a capital crime and is put to death, then hung on a tree, his body is not to remain all night on the tree, but you must bury him the same day, because a person who has been hanged has been cursed by God, so that you will not defile your land, which Adonai your God is giving you to inherit." All right. While our previous two lessons dealt with the responsibilities of Israeli public officials, this changes course. Now we deal with private individuals, and we deal with families and with their neighbors. And the first issue deals with the human spoils of war. See, it was common in ancient times among most societies to take women and children as captives and make them slaves as part of the spoils of war. And when we read the Greek classics, we find the same thing occurring. So many of the laws that we're going to see here are quite similar to laws found as recorded in the Code of Hammurabi and in the Mari law code documents, but there is one striking difference. The Hebrew laws give the women prisoners of war the status of human beings of value, not simply chattel that equates with animals or furniture. Therefore, the issue that's being dealt with here is about a woman taken captive that a soldier finds attractive. He wants to make her his wife. But let's not miss the very important context of this expose. We're speaking only of Hebrew soldiers taking foreign women, foreign captives, as wives. Now, I pointed out way back on our study of Genesis that to speak of genealogical purity as regards Hebrews is almost an oxymoron. From the time that God set Abraham apart as the first Hebrew, thus meaning that all others on the planet were goyim, Gentiles, and therefore also ger, foreigners, to Abraham's clan. God defined a pathway for any ger, any foreigner who wanted to join Abraham's clan to worship his God to be able to do so. And by joining Abraham's clan and his Hebrew descendants' tribes, this former Gentile foreigner is now considered a Hebrew. I want to give you a biblical example of foreigners joining Israel. When Abraham's grandson Jacob came back to Canaan from his 2 decades long stay up in Mesopotamia, and he settled outside of the city of Shechem, a tragic incident actually led to the size of his own family multiplying virtually overnight. It was when the king of Shechem's son raped Jacob's daughter Dinah that her brothers attacked the city of Shechem and killed every adult male. That ring a bell? Genesis tells us that Jacob's sons, the future tribal leaders of Israel, also took all the women and children of Shechem to be their slaves. In time, almost all of these Canaanite inhabitants of Shechem became part of one Israelite clan or another. It was customary for a tribe or a nation to take prisoners of war from one another as a means to increase the size of their community while decreasing the size of their enemy's community. Wealth was partly measured by the size, matter of fact, in many ways it was mostly measured by the size of one's family and clan, tribe, and nation. The point being that as a result of that raid on Shechem, Israel became almost immediately an ethnically mixed family, composed of Hebrews descended from Abraham and Canaanites, who would in time become naturalized members of Israel. So before Jacob even took his family down to Egypt to remain there for 400 years, Israel was roughly 50% genealogical Hebrews and 50% genealogical Gentiles. And during their time down in Egypt, we're told that there was a tremendous amount of intermarriage between Jacob's family and the Egyptians, as well as with other foreigners, because Egypt had a huge foreign population living there. Even Moses, a Hebrew, married a Midianite woman. Now, we see that same trend continue here in Deuteronomy with a set of laws designed to make it legal for an Israelite soldier to take a female foreign prisoner and make her his wife. By definition, upon that marriage ceremony, she became a Hebrew. So the gene pool, beginning with Abraham, became further diluted. God's concern has never been the racial purity of his chosen people, only their spiritual purity and their faithfulness to him. Now, before we go further concerning what's to happen to this foreign female captive and what rights are accorded to her, I want to point out something that is kind of masked by our English Bible translations. And it occurs in the first verse of our study today, verse 10. The complete Jewish Bible says regarding the capture of these foreign women, it says, and when you take prisoners. Other versions say something like, and when you take some of them captive. Well, literally it says something that I think will be a little bit familiar to your ears. When you take the captives captive. That's what it actually says. And if you're wondering where you might have heard that before, listen to Ephesians 4:8. This is why it says after he, Jesus, went up into the heights, he led captivity captive, and he gave gifts to mankind. Now this phrase, he went up, what could it mean if not that he first went down into the lower parts, that is, of the earth? Last time I explained to you that according to both the Old Testament and New Testament, there existed such people that we call saints, even before Christ was born. These Old Testament Hebrew saints were those who died trusting God and living in Torah, who had faithfully followed, and by that I don't mean perfectly followed, the sacrificial system. So they died in a righteous state in God's eyes. These Old Testament saints didn't go to heaven. They went down to Abraham's bosom, the name of one of two chambers for departed souls that exist under the earth, the other being called in Greek Hades, a place of torments. Yeshua also referred to Abraham's bosom when he was up on that cross as paradise. Now, the Hebrew saints of old remained captive in Abraham's bosom, which was a place of peace and joy and shalom, until Messiah had completed his earthly ministry. Then he ascended, at which time he took the inhabitants with him to heaven. The phrase in Ephesians 4 that speaks of how Yeshua led captivity captive is an odd one. I think we've all struggled a little bit to make any sense of. Well, here's another case that whereby studying the Torah makes the question much more easily resolved. In Deuteronomy 21:10, we have the same phrase, and it means the same thing as it means in the New Testament. And this odd-sounding phrase is just the result of Hebrew word structure. Yes, the New Testament documents, including Ephesians, were written in Greek. However, always remember, this is Hebrew thought coming from a Hebrew culture, and it's Hebrew phraseology. Much of it taken, by the way, direct from the Old Testament that's being transmitted to us. It was simply written down, and accurately for the most part, in Greek. Therefore, what is meant in Ephesians 4:8 is that these Old Testament saints called captives, which they were, who had been held safely, but they couldn't get out, so they were indeed captive inside of Abraham's bosom, Christ now took with him to heaven. So what we see in both Deuteronomy 21:10 and in Ephesians 4:8 is a change in status of those who are being affected. In Deuteronomy, these Gentile women are having their status changed from being free Canaanites to being captive prisoners of Israel. And some of the women will eventually marry Hebrew men, and they will lose all of their Canaanite identity. Now, in Ephesians 4:8, the captives of Abraham's bosom are having their status changed by Messiah. They're going from being citizens of a holding area that is not in heaven, but it is in a godly place, to being citizens of heaven in the very presence of God. And by the way, from the moment that Yeshua took those captives to heaven with him, Abraham's bosom has become permanently vacant. Because all who trust God by means of faith in Messiah now go directly to heaven. They don't go to some intermediate place. So a foreign woman is taken captive as a result of war. An Israelite soldier takes a fancy to her, wants to marry her, and the procedure is he takes her home, his home, for a period of 1 lunar month, 30 days. And the foreign woman is to shave her hair, cut her fingernails, and discard the clothing she was captured in. And during this time, these verses say she's also to mourn her parents. Let's talk about this. What does all this mean? What's really going on here? Well, while there's not a full consensus, the meaning is becoming pretty agreed upon by Bible scholars. Now, by shaving her hair, it does not mean she had her head shaved. It just means she cut her hair. Trimming her fingernails, changing into Hebrew garments from her Canaanite garments, is a process of changing her identity from Gentile to an Israelite. Each culture had a more or less unique hairstyle and clothing style, and just like today, the women usually decorated their fingernails. But by getting rid of all these things, her ties with her old lifestyle are symbolically left behind. This further extends to the idea of her mourning her mother and father. It's not necessarily that her parents were killed. I mean, no doubt it happened because they may have died in the war. Rather, it is she's being given an opportunity to forget her parents, so to speak, to give up her natural familial associations that she was born into, theoretically in favor of new ones by means of her Hebrew husband and her new Hebrew identity. We get exactly the same picture, of course, in the New Testament for new believers. In Mark 10:29, Yeshua said, "Yes, I tell you, there is no one who has left house, brothers, sisters, mother, father, children, or fields for my sake, and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100 times over now and in the olam hazeh," it means the present world, "homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and lands with persecutions," and in the olam haba means the future, the world of tomorrow, eternal life. We also get the same instruction regarding marriage in that a couple is to leave their parents, giving up their primary identity as being part of their parents' household, and instead the couple is to cleave together. They're to create a new identity as a married couple. So the concept in the Old Testament is that this captive foreign woman leaves behind her Gentile identity with her original family, a Canaanite family, for a new one, an Israelite one. And wouldn't you just know it, that is exactly the spiritual sense of it in the New Testament, and it's of what Yeshua was communicating about leaving behind your identity as a member of the world of Gentiles in favor of becoming a member of the kingdom of God, of Hebrews. Now, verse 13 makes it clear that only after this 1 month waiting period can the man marry this woman and then consummate the marriage. Inherent in this is that if the woman's miserable and she's staunchly resistant to this new reality, marriage doesn't happen. Likely because if she's a miserable person to be around, he's not going to want to marry her. Therefore, as it says in verse 14, if the man changes his mind before the end of 30 days and decides he didn't want to marry this foreigner, she's to go free. Not as a slave, but as a free person. He can't then change his mind and sell her to somebody else. He can't change his mind and make her his unwilling slave. So we see the decency and the great regard that the law of Moses has for women, even women, foreign women prisoners. Now, I well understand that in modern Western society, even this is hardly considered a delightful prospect for a woman. But understand that in this era, every society was totally male-dominated. That God would make it a law for Hebrews to give women rights and hold them up as valuable as men was quite a shift from normalcy. They were quite unique in this regard. It would become a cornerstone, by the way, of the Hebrew way of life. Well, beginning in verse 15, the subject shifts to what happens in a polygamous family when one wife is loved more than the other by the husband. Now, some translations say about this, when one wife is loved and the other is hated. Our complete Jewish Bible calls one loved and the other unloved. Understand that the meaning here is not a case of intense like versus intense dislike. It's also not a case of complete devotion to one wife and utter disdain for the other wife. Rather, it is that one wife is more favored than the other. And the reality is that this is at the root of why God does not want polygamy among his people. Polygamy causes nothing but trouble. There is no way that a man can have two wives and not have some preference of one over the other, even if the degree in his mind is small. And even if he is as even-handed as is humanly possible, what woman is going to honestly believe that she's being dealt with fairly as compared to her rival? What wife is not going to try to become the more favored wife? This exact scenario was played out several centuries prior to the laws of Moses in the story of the life of Jacob. He was tricked into marrying Leah, then had to agree to keep her as his wife in order to marry the one he really wanted to marry, Rachel, Leah's sister. Now, talk about the worst of all worlds. I mean, this man's married sisters who are often natural rivals anyway. And one of them, he didn't even want to marry. Naturally, he loves Rachel more than Leah, and this causes big problems in Jacob's household. It's not that he didn't love Leah, but his affections were far more towards Rachel, and it must have been pretty obvious. Now, Reuben, poor Leah's son, even schemed with his mother to feed Jacob an aphrodisiac, mandrakes, in hopes of making Leah more desirable to Jacob and thereby soothing his mother's constantly hurt feelings. But the issue of multiple wives gets even more complicated once it gets to be time to pass on the family inheritance to the next generation. The next couple of verses then envisions a very typical problem among a polygamous family. A father is instinctively going to want to give the firstborn rights to the son of his favored wife over the son of his less favored wife, even if the less favored wife's son was born first. Again, the prime example of what can happen is with good old Jacob. And in fact, I begin to think he was born to be an example. Indeed, his firstborn son was Reuben, the child of the less favored wife, Leah. So even though it was for what seems to be a legitimate reason, Reuben was passed over. And the firstborn rights were given to Joseph, Jacob's 11th child. But he was a son of his favored wife, Rachel. By custom and tradition, it was the wrong thing to do. And here in verse 16 is the explicit statement that a father must not pass over the eldest son, even if he's the son of the least favored wife. But Jacob, he did exactly that. Now, we don't have to work very hard to conjure up a mental picture of all this, do we? In our era of divorces being common, and the standard inclusion of stepchildren in what sociologists now call blended families, dividing up one's attention among these children of different fathers and mothers is tough enough. But dividing up the inheritance? That really gets dicey. It's nearly impossible to please all involved or for all to feel that the division was fair. Now, another connected subject is dealt with beginning in verse 18. It's what to do with the matter of a wayward son. Put another way, what is to be done with a rebellious and defiant male child? And the next few verses answer that question. First, the rebellious son is defined as one who does not obey his mother and father even after they've tried to discipline him in all the standard ways. Second, it is that the mother and father must agree. Both of them must agree together. Something serious has to be done about this. Third, they essentially turn him over to the civil authorities now. Now, if the civil authorities think that this son is a particularly worthless son, the Hebrew expression for this is a glutton and a drunk, then he's stoned to death. Now, does that sound a little severe to you? Sounded pretty severe to the rabbis too. The rabbis decreed that the punishment was so severe that they made rulings that required such an extreme and unlikely set of circumstances to unwind in order for this rebellious son to be executed that it really never happened. In fact, we won't find a single case of it in the Bible, of parents turning over their defiant son to the elders to be executed. Basically, this law was only used as a means to strike fear into an incorrigible child. You know, kind of like I'm sending you off to a military academy. The noted Bible scholar J.C. Maxwell made this observation on this subject of rebellion and disobedience, and I want to share it with you, and I hope you have the ears to hear. When a person, a Christian, is confronted with his own disobedience to biblical commandments, he or she is more likely to hear and sneer than to hear and fear. Why is that? The church body lacks discipline. The greatest deterrence to sin in a society is that the people love God and fear Him by means of obeying His commands. Love without fear is but mush. Fear without love is simply legalism. Only the two together in proper balance will bring about the obedience required by God. That's a pretty good statement. I want to point out a couple of things about the procedures with the disobedient son, then we'll move on quickly to the next topic. Notice that the parents must agree. The mother has equal weight with the father in this matter, showing just how unusually powerful a mother was in a Hebrew family as compared to most others in that era. And I think today there's not much more powerful thing in this world than a Jewish mother. And next, this is not a matter that the parents have made a decision that their child should die, so they bring their son to the elders for execution. Execution is just the maximum allowed sentence that can be imposed. And other remedies are typically available and preferred. The point is, the parents would not be the judge and jury. They simply brought a particularly hard case to the town's court. And the courts investigated, and the courts made a judgment on the matter of how best to deal with this problem child. Now, further notice that it is the men of the town who theoretically will stone this rebellious child to death. The parents are not asked to be involved, of course, due to the many other principles that have been set down by God about what can be reasonably expected between parents and their offspring. We also see the Lord's purpose behind this harsh consequence that He orders in verse 21. And here's the purpose. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear it and they'll be afraid. I'll tell you, totalitarian societies know all too well how to utilize fear to control people. Fear is the main tool used to one degree or another in virtually every society that I'm aware of to maintain order. From a biblical point of view, fear of the consequences of doing wrong is not only a good and healthy thing, it's indispensable. The difference between the type of fear that God is ordering versus that brought about by totalitarian societies is that in the one case, actual evil is being fought and purged from the community. In the other, evil is being wrought upon the community. The entire reason that the Lord demands such harsh consequences for evil rebellion against Him by trespassing against His fundamental principles is for the benefit of everyone else. I'm afraid that our modern progressive societies have forgotten just how it is that evil must be eradicated, or it will affect and infect others. And evil certainly isn't effectively dealt with by means of education of the criminal. The final topic of Deuteronomy 21 has many ramifications that I think most of you are going to quickly recognize. It is that if a man is justifiably executed for a capital offense, then if part of that procedure is to have his corpse impaled on a stake, he must be taken down before nightfall. Where have we heard that principle before? Of course, in the crucifixion of Christ. It was the norm in Bible times that the body of a dead criminal was put up on a pole or on a stake for public display. It was intended to act as a rather gruesome reminder of what happens to a trespasser of the law. Sometimes the stake was a large pointed pole upon which the man was actually impaled upon to kill him. At other times, more often than not, it was after he was dead, then he was impaled on the post. However, the hung on a pole or stake phrase doesn't indicate that the means of his being placed there was necessarily impalement. Two things about this. First of all, important, hanging in the Bible does not mean strangulation by the neck at a gallows. The Hebrews didn't employ hanging by the neck. Second, more often than not, the corpse had his arms tied to a crossbeam, which was then mounted at the top of the pole that was located beside a roadway, some other very visible place. Impalement of the body was not the usual or customary method, but it did happen. Now, proper and respectful treatment of the dead, even of a criminal, was the norm for Middle Eastern cultures. There were exceptions, of course. Here the Lord does not try to discourage the practice. He doesn't try to stop the hanging of a corpse of a criminal in a public place. Rather, it is that at the end of the first day of his death, enough's enough. He's to be taken down and he's to be buried. Further, the criminal's body can't just be thrown over a cliff, can't be laid out to rot for scavengers to do what scavengers do. Rather, the body has to be buried at the end of the same day of his execution. That's the rule. Now, what this final verse tells us is that while respect for the dead is appropriate, there is a spiritual reason for this treatment of a corpse. It is that to not bury that body is an affront to God. If the body is not buried, then the consequence is that the land itself will be defiled. What does this remind you of that we just studied this past week? Blood guilt. The principle I stated at the outset of our lesson is that to kill a man is not automatically wrong, but one's to follow God's procedures to determine if death is appropriate or not. And if it is appropriate, how the killing is to be carried out. It matters. And now this instruction is all about the treatment of a dead criminal's body. And if one follows all of these instructions, then this killing not only does not bring blood guilt upon the people or the land, it actually purges the blood guilt upon the people or the land. The blood guilt created by that criminal's act. But if the instructions aren't followed, even if the accused is fully guilty, then even his justifiable killing brings blood guilt upon the community and the land. I want to bring today's lesson to a close with this parallel between the statements about Yeshua's death on the cross and these statements here about being hung on a pole. First of all, let's look at the statement in Deuteronomy 12:23. There it says, because a person who has been hanged has been cursed by God. By definition, and many translators add the words, being hanged means being hanged on a pole because, like I said earlier, there was no hanging by the neck until dead in Hebrew society. And before we go to the New Testament, I want to be very clear about what this is saying. What it is not saying is that the result of being hung on a pole is that that person is cursed of God. Rather, it does mean that the person is cursed of God, therefore, they're being hung on a pole in consequence. Being hung on a pole is because they were cursed by God. Curse has been laid on them. Now, death by execution was understood to be a legal, formal, and final separation of a person from the community of God. With that understanding, let's look now at the well-known verse in the New Testament that speaks of the state of a person who is hanged as it relates to Messiah in Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." First of all, when Paul says it's written, what do you suppose he's referring to? The Holy Scriptures, which was, of course, what we call the Old Testament. That's all the Bible there was in his day. In this case, the passage he was quoting when he wrote this down in Galatians 3:13 is the exact place in the Torah that we're studying today, Deuteronomy 21:23. The Jews of Paul's day fully understood the dramatic and forceful statement he was making, even if they didn't fully understand all the spiritual and redemptive implications of it. Christ took upon himself the curse of the law, which is the penalty of death, in both the sense of physical death and spiritual separation from the Father, as a redemption payment for us, so that we don't have to face that curse. I want you to listen very carefully, please. I want you to store this away in your memories. When the New Testament speaks of the curse of the law, it's speaking of one thing: death. Complete death. Physical death plus spiritual death. That is the curse of the law. The curse of the law is death. The blessing of the law is life, abundant life. That's what we're told all the way through the Old Testament and the New Testament. Another parallel term for this in the New Testament is one we're all familiar with. The wages of sin is death. You receive the curse of the law, death, because your sin earned it for you. You earn death because of sinning. These statements about the curse of the law and the wages of sin are just two ways of saying the same thing. The Father cursed Christ. The proof of which, says Paul, is what? Yeshua was hung on a stake. Jesus' separation from the community of God, his physical death, and for a few moments, his separation from the Father. You think that's not true? Listen to this, Matthew 27:46. At about 3, Yeshua uttered a loud cry, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you deserted me? This was the moment of the sacrificial substitution for what rightfully ought to happen to us. So by studying the Torah, we can better see what happened at Christ's crucifixion. It was the law of Deuteronomy 21 that any executed criminal had to be removed from the death stake before nightfall. That the women hurried to get Yeshua off that cross and buried before the Sabbath would be ushered in at sunset is true. But it is secondary to the fact that not to do so would have broken the law of Deuteronomy 21. Even if the next day hadn't been a festival Sabbath, which it was critical that Messiah's body be taken off that pole and buried. And what would have been the result if they had not been able to persuade the Romans to cut Christ down? And it says here in Deuteronomy 21:23, the land would have been defiled with blood guilt, and the local community of Jerusalem, these women disciples included, would have been saddled with Christ's blood guilt. It is truly a fascinating and sad commentary on the depraved state of the Jewish religious leadership of Yeshua's era that the priests who watched him die didn't seem to care a whit about God's law in this matter. They didn't care whether that Jewish man might hang on that pole overnight, thereby soaking everyone and everything in Jerusalem in blood guilt. Rather, it was the common Jewish folks who knew what had to be done in order to obey God, and they did it. Next week, we'll begin Deuteronomy chapter 22. Please rise.